Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and it's a real privilege here on a Saturday night at 8:34 p.m. Eastern Time, where we can all get together and have this really interesting conversation tonight with Kolby Reddish and Jacob Hansen. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Hey, Steve.
Good evening.
Good evening. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time. It's the middle of the summer. It's July. Across the street, our new house, they just put in the sod yesterday. That was the last thing they were waiting on. So the new house will be moved into in the next week or two, next couple of weeks. Thank you for all your thoughts and prayers. It's been kind of a stressful time. Thank you to my friend, a neighbor Eddie, who's letting us stay at his place, and we're able to be right across the street. Moving can be very stressful, so just keep Mom and I in your prayers during the next few weeks. And of course, that's why I won't be able to go to Sunstone, won't be able to do all these other things because we've been waiting for this move to happen. But hopefully in September, I'll be able to get to John Whitmer Historical Association to catch a sneak preview of the Joseph Smith daguerreotype film. So in Council Bluffs, Iowa. So I'm hopeful to do that. Also, I just want to let people know that I did earlier this month tape an interview with Jacob Hansen and John Turner. I have not released it yet because this time of year, everybody's on vacation and nobody watches anything during this period of time from about 4th of July till mid-August. So we're going to wait to release that. We also did an interview with David Boyce of 52 Churches in 52 Weeks, who talks about his new channel, 52 Temples in 52 Weeks. And of course, I did do my interview with Thomas Murphy the other day about his new book, Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois, and the Book of Mormon, which I find to be really a fascinating book that I think adds another level of complexity to the Book of Mormon that I just find remarkable and very exciting. So, gentlemen, Jacob, a couple weeks ago, we were talking on the phone, and I was just like, dude, I'm seeing you're causing some more trouble. You're riling up the hornet's nest, and I'm like, what are you doing? And you're like, hey, I want to talk to Colby about this. I'm like, okay. So, so for whatever reason, you wanted to have this particular conversation with Colby tonight, which I appreciate. And so we're just going to get right into it. And Colby, I know you have a few comments to make, a couple of clips that you want to show. So why don't we get ready for that in a second? But what we're going to try to do is we're going to shoot for brevity here, so it doesn't become an argument or a slog. This is more of a conversation. I like to say Jackson Washburn and Jacob Hansen have something very much in common with each other. What can normally be said in two sentences, they'll say in two paragraphs. And, and so for tonight, we're going to try to go with the two-sentence model as opposed to the two-paragraph model tonight. Jacob, before I get started, maybe just kind of briefly talk about what you have said, why it's so controversial, some of the feedback you got, and then we'll get Colby in on the conversation.
Yeah, actually, Colby, I think, has the clips that kind of are behind all of it. So we could just go directly to what I said, really. It's essentially just some of my feelings about the nature of diversity in the church and kind of, I think we're going to get more into it.
Hmm.
But essentially, I have a view on diversity in the church that I believe lines up with the teachings of the church, honestly, about the subject. So the clips, I think, we'll get into a little bit of what I've said, and then I can kind of clarify a little bit about what I mean by that, because I haven't really had a chance, and especially with somebody like Colby who has a different point of view, I think it'd be good because I can clarify it to someone who maybe doesn't kind of see things my way, generally speaking.
Okay, so you actually are setting up your own clips here for Colby. Colby, before we get started, did you want to kind of get us prepared for what you're going to be showing us here?
No, I just pulled these two
Okay.
clips together, and then yeah, I think we'll get into the more specifics of the example that Jacob used in the second clip. So if I remember correctly, Jacob, you were first on Word Radio where the first clip happens, then you kind of did a follow-up on your own channel. So let's
Yep,
play maybe this first one, and then you can clarify anything you'd like to. That's fine with me.
sure. Are people willing to die for this church anymore? How many people are willing to die for it?
Yeah.
As a percentage? Okay, let's say today it's 30%. But how many was in the pioneer era? It was like 90%. If you start to take your core membership and actually give them something to really believe in and be united around, you'll get something. And here's the thing, we're not united. We're incredibly divided because we've lost our sense of who we are as Latter-day Saints. You have such a wide variety of, see, we talk about diversity as though it's a strength. Let me tell you something. Ideological diversity is a cancer. And in the church, we have ideological diversity to where you go everywhere. You have people cheering for Charlie Bird, who is literally with his gay partner, purchasing a child because they want to be parents. They're going to have a baby created through in vitro fertilization of another woman, and they're going to deprive a child of its mother. And there are active, faithful Latter-day Saints cheering for Charlie Bird and his partner as they deny a child their mother. And we are divided on that issue as Latter-day Saints. Me bringing this up is controversial. Are you kidding me?
Okay. So that's our first clip. Jacob, any way you want to clarify that, or like you said you think there are a few ways you might want to elaborate on what you mean or clarify what you meant.
Not much. I mean, I pretty much stand by what I said. I would maybe make the the clarification when I say, are people willing to die for this church? You have to realize that with what the church claims to be, if it claims to be the Church of Jesus Christ, of the Latter-day Saints, that has been restored, and it's the same gospel that Jesus called people to live and die for, like we have to realize we're dealing with the same movement that like the people were willing to be fed to lions for. You know what I mean? And it's sort of like, why would people do that? Well, they didn't, for a church, was it for a church? It was for Jesus Christ. Because I fundamentally believe that the church is actually the Church of Jesus Christ. And if Latter-day Saints actually believe that, then like the martyrs of history, I think that it'll show in your, like, do you take it sufficiently seriously what the church actually is and what it stands for? Or is this just a social club you inherited from your parents?
Why do you think you used the word church instead of Jesus Christ? I was just curious about that.
Because we believe the fundamental claim of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that Jesus Christ has restored his church. And what his church is it's the covenant people. It's the covenant body. It's Israel. It's what the whole covenant story is about, is that God has a covenant people that he is leading and guiding. And we kind of live in a world of radical Protestantism that wants to say that it's all about your individual relationship with Jesus, when the Bible story, the Bible story from start to finish, from a Latter-day Saint perspective, obviously, the Protestants are going to disagree with that. But if you're a Latter-day Saint, you're not a Protestant. We believe in the covenant sort of people of God. And so, to me, the church and the covenant people of God are the same thing.
Okay.
So I just wanted to say, from my perspective, first of all, I do come from a long line of Dutch Reformed Calvinists on both sides of the family. So that's a very covenantal people as well. Matter of fact, the Afrikaners actually did a covenant with God when they were settling the land in South Africa. So it's very much covenant driven as well. That's the tradition in which I was born in. And sometimes I like to have fun with the radical individualism that I do think there is a type of Protestantism that I kind of do ascribe to. But I'm curious, Jacob. Do you consider heterosexual couples who have in vitro fertilization, consider them purchasing a child?
No, absolutely not.
So why?
That's just using medical means to generate their own child. With Charlie Bird, for example, the child won't know their mother ever.
Well, but
There could be
that's
exactly analogous situations with a heterosexual couple where, say, the woman doesn't produce eggs, they
right.
have to use the eggs from a surrogate mother.
Yeah, I'm against using the eggs from someone else to bring a child into the world. I am against that.
You are
And the
saying that
church, that isn't, so surrogacy, where it's like, so if we want to get into the whole surrogacy discussion, surrogacy where it's okay, my wife is incapable of carrying the child, her body won't for whatever reason carry the child, but my sperm and her egg, the father and the mother, their two parts come together, and then some other woman volunteers to carry the child to term using her body. That child is then delivered right back to their mother and father. I don't have an issue with that. What I have an issue with is when you have two men who are bringing a child into this world using another woman, and then that child now doesn't ever get to know their mother. And I do think it is wrong for anyone to sell their eggs so that someone else can have a child. I don't believe that. You don't sell your children.
Okay, so you're saying that you would have the same you would apply the same standard to
Yeah.
heterosexual couples. Okay,
Yeah.
so I wanted to you to
And
clarify
if I'm
that.
not mistaken, the church's policy on surrogacy of that kind, I think, is like that you're not supposed to. I'm pretty sure I'm perfectly aligned with the church's policy on that matter.
No,
Someone could check me on that, but
no,
but I
keep in
believe so.
in much of Europe, actually, surrogacy and in vitro fertilization are illegal, even
Yeah.
to this
Well,
day, or
well,
surrogacy, and yeah,
and that's the thing. There's a difference between surrogacy.
yeah,
I look at
Yeah, there's
surrogacy as
different
just someone
forms.
else
right,
is
right,
carrying your child.
hmm
And in vitro fertilization, that's just the process by which, I mean, lots of Latter-day Saints do that
right, correct.
to try and have children. I just look at that as a way to try and help the pregnancy happen, right?
Okay, very
So,
good. Colby, anything else before we go on to the next clip?
Well, I think just so it sounds like you're saying you would be ideologically consistent for a heterosexual couple that was using surrogacy and vitro fertilization in the same way. I think one of the things I would like to ask you about is the language you had about Charlie is pretty strong. I understand Charlie is a public figure, but in the past you've said that you're hard on ideas, soft on people. Like, do you see any tension with like talking about individual people like that strongly? Like they're
yeah,
purchasing
I
a child from
do.
its mother
I mean, I
is pretty
do.
strong.
You're right. I just am describing what's actually happening. And in this case, what's actually happening with a public figure and with Latter-day Saints cheering it on, in my mind, this is to speak out to hopefully get him and everyone else doing this to reconsider because you are harming a child. And I think you do have the obligation to speak out publicly against people that are harming children.
When you say harming a child, you mean harming a child like based on your beliefs, or is there like biological evidence that's harming a child?
Does
What
a
is
does
that
a chi-
based off of?
does a child need a mother?
Does a child need a mother? Are you talking biologically, or are you talking about like
Like
having a
what
relationship with the
is
mother?
a child entitled to birth to a mother and a father?
Are they entitled to birth to a mother and a father? I don't know how I would answer that question. Um,
Yeah, for me that's real. It's a real simple one. They are absolutely entitled to it. That is the way that. Again, I mean, I'm not sure what sort of a standard you use for making moral judgments, but I would look at a moral situation in which a child is not going to have a mother or a father, and you're intentionally creating that situation. It's a tragedy when a child doesn't have a mother or a father, when one is missing. Either way, I think that the science, so far as I understand it, is perfectly clear that a father mother is the ideal household for a child. And that is when you don't have a mother or you don't have a father, something is missing from the equation that is very, very hard to replicate. And we can get close and if you have a terrible mother and father, like, yeah, I mean, obviously I would rather, and I say this fully, I would rather a child be with Charlie and his partner than be with an abusive mother and father who are actually their biological mother and father. Like, it's not like I don't think exceptions can't exist. But when you are intentionally taking the steps to create a new human person with the intention of that child never knowing who their mother is or never having their mother in a full sense, you're doing something deeply wrong to that child for your own purposes. And with all the children that are needing adoption, like that just seems wild to me.
Yeah, I can understand that perspective when it comes to adoption because I have a family member of mine that is adopted, and obviously, like my family was able to fulfill, that need that my family member had. So I can understand that
And to
that part
clarify,
of the perspective.
Jacob, so what you're saying here is that you actually are in favor of gay and lesbian couples adopting children. You just don't want them making new children.
I am owned on under certain circumstances. I will say that if all things are equal, okay, and I have two couples, I have a heterosexual and a homosexual, or a husband and wife, and then Charlie and his partner, right? And all things are equal, like all aspects. I would say that the heterosexual couple should take precedence because I do believe that male and female are a more ideal. Like it isn't equal. I don't view uh I don't believe those unions are equal when it comes to raising children, not only on sort of the moral level, but on just like the demonstrable research level that shows that a child needs both a mother and a father. Men and women are not the same. I don't buy that for a minute. I believe gender actually is a meaningful category, and that so I am okay with it. I'm okay with that so long as there is not a better alternative available. I would much rather a child be with, as I said, with a gay couple than be in a foster system, being shuffled around, not feeling like they have a home, and that. I do actually believe that. And there are people that get on my case about it, and I frankly don't care because I really do think that it's a really bad situation when a child ends up without, you know, some kind of a genuine home that they have.
Okay, so
So
well, I just
just
want
based
okay.
on you saying that it's based on research, like, can you, I guess I'm not familiar with that research. Can you help explain to me like what the effects are or where you remember reading something that said this?
Yeah, so I'm trying to pull that up, all the stuff I have off the top of my head. I have looked into it. So, like, for example, if you have a home, or just on like a religious level, right? Just, well, I don't know if I use that example. I guess the alternative is this. It's to say that the uniqueness of a father or a mother, the uniqueness of maleness or femaleness in parenting is not actually relevant, right? And by the way, I do have research. I don't have it like at my fingertips. But the research that I have seen has shown that it isn't just to have two people in the home that care for the child. It's like your actual mother and your actual father, and because they are male and because they are female, they bring something different sort of inherently to the structure of the relationship. For example,
Do you remember roughly like what the deleterious effects on the child are?
yeah, so let's use this for example. A young male, for example, a boy, who is being raised
Can I
by,
pause you for a
yeah,
second?
yeah.
Just make sure. Is this like from the research or this is just a hypothetical example?
This is from the research that, and I'm kind of recalling it off the top of my head, but it also
Okay.
is just kind of, I think every one of us know that this is kind of how it goes. Okay. Um, Boys with their fathers have a different sort of relationship than boys with their mother or mothers. If you had two, a boy who's being raised by his grandma and his mom, it's a different situation than when he's being raised by his father. Okay. His father brings a sort of masculine energy to the relationship that kind of controls the boy. And some of that has to do with genuine, like physical force. The idea that boys grow up kind of knowing that your old man can kind of take you. And at the end of the day, if you get totally out of line, your dad may physically actually engage with you and he'll take you. Okay? Now, boys who grow up and turn about 14, 15 years old, all of a sudden they realize, a lot of boys realize this. Mom can't do anything if I just say no. Like I can just tell mom, like, no, I'm going to my friend's house. I'm going to ground you. I don't care. What are you going to do? Right? Now, Kolby, if your son was 15 years old and told your wife to go to hell and that he's going to his friend's house whenever he wants, what would you do?
I would be so psyched that he's getting out of the house, Jacob. I'm just kidding.
We know what you'd do because you're a man and you're a good husband and father. And you'd stand up for your wife and you'd say, how dare you talk to her like that? You get in the house right now. And there is an element of like, the boy learns that he can't get away with everything. And what happens is when you have, and that's why fatherless homes have incredibly high rates of violence and problems with the young men, because when you don't have a man in the house, and that is backed by the scientific research, by the way, that's one of the most known things ever, and everyone knows that a fatherless home is a big deal. And it isn't like, oh, well, if you just put another woman in there, if grandma gets involved, then that'll solve the problem. The reality is that young men respond differently to women than they do to men. And this is, again, in a biological, in a pack of chimpanzees. When you don't have a dominant male, who is ultimately kind of the authority there with physical force, it affects the way the younger males behave. So I think that our genders as men and women actually matter. And I think the same can be said on the other side. I won't go into all the explanations, but I think that women bring something unique to a raising of a child that a man can't bring. And so those two factors, you need both to have, again, the ideal situation. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think that there can be exceptions. There have to be exceptions because life is messy. But to intentionally create a less than ideal situation for a child is wrong.
Okay. And I'm only going to push back on this a little bit because my memory, and again, I also am not like, don't have the research. I'm looking at the tip of my finger or at the top of my fingertips or top of my mind, but is that there have been a number of different studies that have found there really isn't any deleterious psychological, social effects being raised by same gender couples. That's my memory based on an episode I had done responding to the Light and Truth letter. But again, maybe we can follow up with resources on exactly what that looks like because I guess the only other thing I'd push back on is I don't necessarily believe like I believe obviously the science about single parent households. I think maybe you're connecting a cause differently than I would. I don't really parent based on like physical force threats or even the threat of physical force. And I'm not saying that you do. I'm saying I can understand maybe the idea, like from a younger biological level, but I just see there's probably a lot of alternatives to correcting a child's behavior than like needing a physical imposition of force.
And I would say that I can see what you're saying there. And the research that I've looked at and just the example that I gave, like, yeah, if you have a fairly decently behaved kid, but the reason that kids behave, one of the reasons that males behave as they get older is because there's another male around that keeps them in check. When there is no male around that keeps them in check, it's very, very easy for them to realize their power. And the thing is there is another male who gets involved. Like, what does mom do when her kid's totally out of control physically? She calls men. She calls men on the phone, called the police. And big, strong men show up and they get involved. And so there, and you're right. I'm not saying that you lead with force. I'm never like, that's not what I'm saying. But like,
Mhm.
what's the ultimate backstop? It's force.
Jacob,
And when a boy knows that there's force in the home as the ultimate backstop, that's a totally different dynamic than when the force is outside the home. Because guess what? Most moms aren't going to call the cops because their kid is disobeying them. They're going to just, all right. And that's what happens in these. And again, in a single mother home, like, again, we can say, well, it's just single moms. And so they kind of are overstressed. Adding another woman to the equation doesn't change the dynamic. Men have there's a dominance hierarchy that exists in our species. And fathers are the dominant male of their home. And that's just biological. Like, none of that has to do with any spiritual stuff. And so to just deny that that dynamic matters at all, again, it totally changes the equation. I would say there's also things that women bring to the table that a man just simply, not that they can't, but it's much more difficult and it's less likely that they're going to. So.
Hmm. So you do feel there's a physical dominance hierarchy to our species?
Absolutely.
Just to confirm.
100%.
Hmm.
Yeah, if you watch young men, for example, or especially boys as they start to get older, they begin to size each other up kind of physically and socially. Now, it isn't all physical. Like but there is that side of it. And boys will, one of the reasons boys bully other boys is it's to sort of assert that they're higher than the other person in the dominance hierarchy of that particular pack of boys. And so if a boy starts to, for example, be more than another boy thinks he should be, he sees another boy asserting his sort of like, oh, I'm really good at this and that. Another boy might bully him in order to say, I'm actually the dominant male around here. You're lower than me on the pecking order. Know your place. And boys, a lot of the times who know that they're not higher on the hierarchy, they will sort of accept the bullying and sort of say, yeah, I'm not a threat. I'm not trying to rise. I'm not competing with you in the dominance hierarchy. And then they don't get bullied, right? But boys who are competing for dominance amongst other boys, a lot of times will hassle, bully, joke, kind of do things to assert that I'm more dominant than you. Now, women do this as well, but they do it in very different ways. um,
I've always
so
just got by on my winning wit, I guess, Jacob.
wit and humor, by the way, is a way that people establish dominance.
Absolutely. As a matter of
That's
fact, Christopher Hitchens made it very clear that that's why male comedians are so dominant, is because it gives them an evolutionary advantage by being
correct.
funny and making women laugh. That is actually one way of getting your genetic material
And make
out there.
and making fun of your opponents is another way to assert your dominance over them. And but also there is that element of when it first, what people will do usually is they'll start with words. Okay. And we know this. If you're going to pack of boys on a playground, it starts with words. I'm asserting my dominance. But then what happens is that a boy may say, you know what? We're changing the levels now. You're talking crap. And that's the word they'll use, right? Like, you're talking, and they come up and they'll confront them. So what did they just do? They said, you're winning with words, but I'm going to assert myself physically now because I can use my physicality to show that I'm more dominant than you. And you know what's funny? A lot of times that works. If it'll sometimes like scare the kid that's making fun of him because that guy's going to beat me up. And so they won't make fun of that person anymore because they're afraid they might get beat up. And so there's this dynamic game. My point isn't all the necessary details of how it all works, but there's a constant desire amongst all people to establish where they fit in a particular pecking order. And so, yes, to answer your question, Kolby, I believe just like any other species, we inherently have dominance hierarchies, competence hierarchies that we are constantly sort of engaging in as part of our normal social lives.
It's very Hobbesian, right?
It is
Like the
to an
natural state of man. Yeah.
yeah, I think mankind is naturally pretty animalistic.
Hmm.
Yeah, I have to say, just being involved in politics, you have a lot of males in that space that are competing, a lot of narcissists. It can be very brutal. Also, I live in a mobile home park, and there's a handful of single mothers here. Guess who gets the phone call when their young boys are acting up? It's often me. And
Yeah.
and so I can assert that's a real life experience I have, is that, and I do see, these boys, and I'm like, man, I don't know if these kids even have a chance, so I just realistically, so I want to say this to you, Jacob. I think it takes a level of courage in the conservative community to advocate for LGBTQ people, couples, like gay couples and lesbian couples, that those would be appropriate places for cases rather than going through the government system, the foster system, or have bad parents. That you think that would be a safe space for those kids. I want to commend you for that, because I think it's an important position to take in the space you occupy.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who thinks that like the abuse that happens to some children, and Kolby, you've worked in the in the world of the absolute worst of that. Like, are you kidding me? I'd go myself and take the kids and take them to Charlie and his partner to be with them because I believe genuinely that it would be a thousand times better situation for a lot of kids, literally not to be with their biological parents and I would rather have them in that situation. Now, with that in mind, like I said, I always want to caveat it. That doesn't mean I'm putting those things unequal. If I have two couples and there's a heterosexual and a homosexual couple and all things are equal, I believe it would be better for the child to have a mother and a father because those again, and this isn't like detached from LDS doctrine. Like we as a church believe gender has a purpose. And my question to anyone, secular or religious, otherwise, like, okay, well, what's the purpose of gender? Why does it matter at all? And I think it matters a great deal demonstrably. And I think that it's really amazing that our church says, yeah, it does matter. And not only does it matter in this life, it matters as part of your eternal identity and purpose. And so that's where something, and here's my, I guess the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of the church and these different things that we're talking about here. It's that, have we as Latter-day Saints forgot about that? Are we so confused that we no longer believe that gender is a part of our eternal identity and purpose? Because that's like central. And one of the central and unique things about our faith, I mean, we literally have in our scriptures that says you can't be exalted unless you enter into a heterosexual marriage. Like, it's just right there in the scriptures. It's not up for interpretation. It's just what it says.
Okay, Jacob, real quick. Kolby, I don't know if you want to follow up on what he said, but I do want us to get to that second clip as well. And so if you want to say something, Kolby, you can, or we could get on to the second clip.
Yeah, I guess, well, I just, to wrap that up, I just want to be clear that my understanding of what science indicates is that there are not deleterious effects on children that are adopted by or raised by same gender couples. Can you just real quickly, Jacob, do you remember what the deleterious effects, like not an example that's a hypothetical, what are the deleterious effects that you remember from the time that you had researched this? Because I just understand it differently. So I can understand talking about like the family proclamation, or I think you were hinting at DNC 132. That's fine, but obviously not everybody shares that same foundation that you do. And so my question is like, is, you know, just bracketing the faith-based question for a second, like what is the biological problem that you see or that you remember from your time in research? If you can remember, because I
I'm
just
trying to
remember it differently.
so again, if it's do I have a specific paper that says that, hey, there's all these deleterious effects of gay couples adopting kids? I actually think that most of the gay parents that are adopting kids are actually very like consciously doing it, and so they tend to be people that are probably pretty good anyway. And so I actually don't imagine, and especially when the kids are coming from really rough situations anyway, it's like it's a good thing, uh, for the most part. Not going to say there aren't some horrible exceptions, but I'm making more of a logical argument here about, is it ideal? Like, just very simply, does it matter if you have a mother and a father? Does that
I
matter?
think
Or
I
are
think
they
that's why I'm
interchangeable?
looking. I think that's why I'm asking the question though about the study and the effects, because we can ask logical questions. We can try and guess what the effects are going to be, but the way that we actually measure that is we do studies and we look to see what the effects are,
You're
because there
right.
are a lot of times, as
So,
you
so
know, that there are things that are counterintuitive about the way logic works.
correct. I don't think anyone disputes that single mother homes
I'm not
are
asking
not.
about single mother homes. I'm asking about same gender.
I know, and this is what I'm saying though, is that
Mhm.
I don't think that adding another, it isn't about that there's just two people there. Okay. Like, it isn't that there just need to be two. I think I'd have to look at, I think it was,
So if that were the case,
you're
what we would
going to have
expect
a
to
similar,
see.
you're going to have the same problems. For example, when a grandmother and a mother are raising the child, as you would in a situation where you have a, um, a it's not going to solve the problem when you have just two women that are raising a boy. You like, I don't accept the premise that, oh, well the real factor that matters here is just that there's two people. I don't think that that's the case. I think that,
But that's based on research that you can't remember. I think that's the issue I'm pushing. And I'm not trying to push you on the research specifically, but I'm not asking you to buy a premise. I'm asking if you have a good reason for the premise you're offering, which is that there's a difference between being raised by same gender couples and being raised by heterosexual couples. Because and again, I'm just going from my memory too, but my memory is that basically every study that's ever been done shows the exact opposite, shows that there are not deleterious effects to being raised by a same gender couple.
and the studies that I've seen, most of the studies I've seen around that, I've are somewhat questionable, but also I would also say that what I've also seen in that research is that you're dealing with a very narrow segment of people that have been selected out that are adopting children rather than looking at um, all things equal. You know what I'm saying? Um,
No. What
the
does that mean?
so here's what I mean. Okay, so the gay couple that's going to go and adopt a child, okay, they are going to be a type of person. There's sort of a self-selection that happens, that they're going to be more sort of conscientious and like they very much want to have this child and they're going to be very attentive parents. And that's a good thing. Now, how do you find people that are equally as attentive of parents that are heterosexuals that are also in that exact same situation so that you can do an equal comparison? I don't think that you can. And as I said, and so the issue that you run into again is it's very hard to find a comparable sample. And then number two is that you have the same issues that we already talked about. The issue of a young man growing up with two women, he's going to be able to simply reject them at some point.
But that's just a hypothetical that you're making up. I'm asking for
No,
like
no, I wouldn't say
any
it's a
actual
hypothetical.
example.
I mean, it's very, very clear that young men who are being raised by women alone, if you just have another woman that you add grandma into the picture, for example, there are examples of mom and grandma are raising the teenage boy, and that teenage boy is more likely to have problems because he doesn't have a male in his life, in his home, that is there to sort of check his normal male desire to, distance himself from his mother, which is what happens. My boys, by the way, are about to turn 13. And my wife is learning quite quickly that the dynamic with her sons is changing very rapidly as they are deciding that they want to be a man now. And all of a sudden, I have to sort of step in more than before because all of a sudden, mom's threats aren't quite as, mom's discipline isn't quite as, taken as seriously as dad's. And I think most parents just know this. And so I would, again, I don't have the studies right in front of me on this, and I'd have to look at a particular study to see its strengths and weaknesses. But
When you say that, because you said that earlier, and then I promise Steve will get to the next clip. This is just interesting to me, just our methodological differences. When you say I need to look at the details of the study, like, do you have a background in sociology, or what's your like? How are you evaluating whether a study is good or
yeah,
bad?
I have a background in statistical analysis through operations management that I have a degree in. I went on to get a degree in data analysis known as a Six Sigma black belt. So I know how to evaluate sort of studies and data sets and random sampling and all that kind of good stuff. Like I
Okay,
do have a history in that. And
okay.
so I'm happy to look at studies that people bring up around this. I have to say that I haven't seen any that have just convinced me. And there's just at the end of the day, I find logical arguments to be the most convincing because I know what you can do with data. And I know it's very easy to pull studies showing this, showing that. I personally just people can look at their own life experience. Go see your 13-year-old boy, 14-year-old, 15-year-old boy, and just see what happens when grandma and mom are raising them. And if it's any different than if mom and dad are raising them. Males and females just are different. And if and they're different biologically. Like this is again from logic. Like male and female within the animal kingdom are very different in the way they
Yeah, sure.
behave, in the
I
way they
don't
interact with children,
I
and
don't think anyone's
to act as though taking one of those elements out doesn't cause an issue. Like to me, it's like how could it not cause an issue?
yeah. I can appreciate that. I don't think anyone on this call is saying they're the same or that gender doesn't matter. But I would tend to expect, like, if we're going to say this causes an issue, that we could name what the issue is, like with specific data, because I don't favor anecdotes over data. I completely agree with you that there are weird games that can be played with data, right? Mark Twain once said there's three types of untruths, lies, damned
Yeah,
lies, and statistics.
statistics. Yep.
And so that's where, like in my program, so my background, I did a bachelor's in biology. Specifically, my emphasis was micro and molecular biology. And so I don't have the background in like sampling that it sounds like you do. But one of the things I learned in like a bioethics class is exactly about those tricks that can be played with data and with studies and how you need to be wary of that. So I can accept that part, but I would be reticent personally. This will be my last pushback on this. I would be reticent personally to say like, well, just use your intuition or just look at your personal anecdote because there are obviously issues with preferencing anecdotes over data. Like one of the reasons that we look at studies is to see what those effects are. So I would push back on the idea of like presuming that just because there's a difference in males and females, that means that we're going to lead to issues in a child being raised if there are surveys and data that indicate the exact opposite, which is my understanding of what the data shows. So,
Do you think there's anything unique that a father brings to the home that a mother can't bring,
so I
that a woman
focus
can't bring?
on, yeah, when you asked that question earlier, I kind of paused because I actually look at it more about individuals. So I think each relationship can be like there are obviously gender stereotypes. There are normal kind of gender norms, but I think like where the contours of how each relationship, provided there is a partnership, kind of figures out those duties and responsibilities, kind of navigates those gender norms, is a lot more up to the individual. So I don't know that I'm as focused on like the gender part of it. It's more like the individual person, if that makes sense.
I can see what you're saying there, and I can appreciate that. My thing is if it does just come down to the individual person, then it's sort of like on the statistical level, we shouldn't see any difference between men and women because it's just sort of it just depends on the individual. But clearly there's patterns around men and women. And if we're talking in generalities about, you're right. There may be, when I get into one particular couple, you're absolutely right. I could look at that particular male-female relationship and say, I would rather the child be with, a gay couple, with Charlie and his partner. I would much rather the child be with them than with their actual mother and father. So I don't deny that on the individual level. But what I'm saying is when we look and we are talking about large population sets, now what we're doing is we are talking in generalities. And I am wondering, what does a father bring to the table that a mother that is that they, because of their gender, have that's different and advantages them by being a male that a woman couldn't, or vice versa? Like, is there anything unique about fathers?
It's just a very vague question. Maybe just tell me what difference you're talking about. Like there are obvious biological differences. There are different things that I bring to the table than my wife, but
Yeah, I would say that men, for example, bring a physical presence to the home that all of us know that, you know, your dad was different than your mom when it came to physical presence. That's one. I think that a mother's sort of nurturing is different than a father's nurturing
Mhm.
statistically, right? Again, individually, you can have cases that vary, but like when you take the mean of all people, that mothers bring something unique. A mother's bond to her infant child, for example, things like breastfeeding, things like again, a lot of these things are very difficult to sort of quantify exactly scientifically, but all of us know them. Like all of us know that moms and dads bring something different to the table. And what I'm saying is like you don't have to deny that obvious fact, because if there is something unique about a mom and a dad, inherently by their nature as being mother or father, that they bring to the table that can't be replaced by someone else. Like, Kolby, if you didn't have your mom, like if there was another woman could she have truly filled the shoes of your mother? Like, she's your mom. She literally shares your DNA. There's only one person that gets to be your mom in this world. And to me, it's like, and that isn't just, in my mind, that isn't even just a physical thing. I think that's a spiritual thing. And so, dealing again, if we want to get into the specifics of the Charlie Bird situation, like they are denying a child that connection to their mother that you and I have been able to have. And that to me is deeply wrong.
Hmm. Okay. Well, should we move on to our second clip?
Let's do it.
Cool.
Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but an LDS influencer recently argued that ideological diversity is a cancer.
I sure did.
And I actually think the exact opposite is true. I think ideological diversity is the bedrock of revelation.
Ooh, let's hear it.
As I've studied church history, I've learned that revelation is messy. The restoration has never advanced because everyone agreed. It has advanced because faithful people brought difficult questions to each other and to the Lord.
So let me pause there now that he's gotten his part of this out, because I think the rest of it is you, Jacob. Do you disagree? Because I know you're going to push back on some of the things he said, but to me, what he just said there is like the messiness of how the restoration has proceeded and how revelation works in the restored church. That just seems like patently true to me when we understand the history of the church. Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily push back on the idea that like difference of opinion is what led to revelation in the church.
Yeah, to a certain degree, yes. I think I kind of clarify it when we get further in.
Okay.
I'll explain a little bit.
Okay.
But why would they take it to the Lord if their diversity of opinion on the matter was their strength? Don't you see the very reason that we seek revelation is so that we can know the truth? And when a collective group of people know what the truth is, there is no longer ideological diversity. For example, not too long ago, we had the opinion that black people were less valiant in the pre-existence. Was it good that we had that variety and diversity of opinion about that matter? Would it be good if we brought back that sort of ideological diversity? Again, the whole point of Revelation is to create unity around the truth. So no, ideological diversity is not the bedrock of Revelation. It's the problem that Revelation seeks to solve. And those who reject the Lord's revelations in favor of an ideological diversity are actually causing division and confusion in the kingdom. And that's why a love of ideological diversity is a cancer.
Jesus did not pray that his followers would be diverse. He prayed that they would be one. Modern revelation does not say, be diverse, and if ye are not diverse, ye are not mine. It says, be one. And if ye are not one, ye are not mine. We teach our members to concentrate their efforts to strengthen our unity, not to glorify our diversity.
Okay. Let me get that down.
All right.
And I say amen to that, President Oaks.
So you said you feel like you clarified that a little bit. I heard you call ideological diversity a problem. That seems in tension with what you had said, that sometimes you think ideological diversity can lead to revelation. Just, I guess maybe can you explain what you mean by ideological diversity?
So my problem isn't that ideological diversity exists. It does exist. And not only that, it can be a good thing if we're wrong about something. Okay? The point of the gospel is to bring people to be of one heart and of one mind. Okay? It's to align us with Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, right now, if we as a church had more people, for example, who thought that black people were less valiant in the pre-existence, would we think that that's a good thing? Is diversity an end in itself? Are we seeking diversity in the church? No, we're not. We're seeking the truth. And the truth, when it is known, it's true, right? We no longer like have that variety of opinions because we know what is true. And that's what we're seeking. We're seeking, the end that we're seeking is the truth. Okay? There are people who seek diversity for diversity's sake. Okay? And by diversity, I'm not talking about racial diversity. I'm talking specifically about differing ideas about what is true. The reason we have differing ideas about what is true is because we're not sure what is true. Now, there have been times, I'm sure that we're going to talk about this, when the church and even its leaders have thought, for example, something was true, that black people were less valiant in the pre-existent, for example. Let's just use that as it, okay? Here's the thing. They were wrong. And so I was glad and I am happy that there was ideological diversity and that everyone didn't accept that false thing. So ideological diversity can be a good thing if we think that we have the truth when we don't, okay? If we're wrong. And the reality is, let's just address the elephant in the room and exactly what's going on here. The people who are chanting for more ideological diversity today think that the church is wrong. That's why they don't want ideological unity. And they think the church is wrong about things like gay marriage. And so because of that, they appreciate ideological diversity, because ideological diversity means that we can say, well, maybe they're wrong. And now we got lots of people in the church who think that they are probably wrong about this. And we have more ideological diversity. And so it's great. But the thing is they're only using ideological diversity as a tool. Flip this around the other way. Would those same people be really glad if there were more and more people in our church that thought that Black people were less valiant in the pre-existence? Of course they wouldn't. On that matter, they say, the brethren have spoken. This is the truth. And all of a sudden, they don't want ideological diversity. So here's the thing. The people who want ideological diversity, the reason they want it is because they think it will help them achieve their goals, because they think that, for example, in the church, gay marriage is wrong, that the brethren have it wrong. And therefore, they want more people to have a diverse opinion on that matter because they think we're wrong. And I just think that's the dynamics of it. So first, diversity is never an end in itself for any group, if you believe in truth, ideological diversity, because the opposite of ideological diversity are people who know the truth and they agree on what's true. And then on the other hand, the people who want ideological diversity over a particular matter, they want it because they know they don't believe that we have a truth in that area. Now, ideological diversity, one last point on this, can be a strength if we don't know what the truth is. Because what it means is we don't know what's true about something. And now we have a lot of different people talking, debating, discussing it, and we're trying to figure out what the truth is. Now, again, the diversity isn't the end, but the diversity is hopefully what will develop naturally amongst the people who are trying to find the truth. Right? There'll be difference of opinions, but they don't look at that as the end in itself. It's just what happens as you're trying to get towards the truth. And it can get you to think different things and open your mind to things that you might not see and you might be wrong about. So hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think my biggest piece of pushback, I guess, would be that when we're talking about spiritual truth, and we'll go to the specific example you selected in a second, I guess I would look at it like, there's this statement from Hume that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, right? And I guess I just would wonder, like, with spiritual truth being so difficult to know, obviously we're going to go through an example where the prophets of the church taught things as doctrine that the church today teaches not only are not doctrine, not only are false doctrine, but they're so fundamentally wrong that it's like missing the overarching message of the Book of Mormon. And I can establish that in just a second if you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you disagree with that?
No,
that's
I
kind of
okay. I mean, obviously we can just be specific on like race, and the theories about race were wrong. They were simply incorrect. And and the justifications they made, when you actually examine them about, the appeals to the scriptures that they made, they don't actually hold up.
Okay. And so I guess my view would be, if you recognize that spiritual truth is so difficult to discern, even for men who claim to be prophets, I can see people who do believe in truth, but recognize that ideological diversity could be a value in and of itself because truth is so difficult to discern. And so they want to bring as many people, as many voices into the body of Christ as possible. And you would push back on that, I assume. When you were talking, you said that if you care about truth, you don't want ideological diversity just as an ends unto itself. Do you still hold to that position, or my pushback? I hold to the idea
that idea, like, diversity is not an end in and of itself. Like, if we had more people that believed that the Earth was flat, we'd have more ideological diversity. That wouldn't be a good thing, right? Like, who genuinely is out there thinking that ideological diversity is like a good end in and of itself? It can maybe help us to break out of things that we think we know that are actually not true. That is true. But again, what's the end goal? It's to help us to find out what is actually true.
So you're saying it couldn't help if someone were to be very skeptical and agnostic to a lot of questions and just say, I want to actually hear from all of the different voices, kind of in the along the lines of the themes of Steve's channel, because I really am not sure that we can actually determine fully what the truth is. And so I'd like to hear these different models that could just be ideological diversity as an ends unto itself. Or you
No,
disagree with that?
no, because I think that why do you want to hear the voices, all these different voices?
Well, ultimately to discover the truth, but if you
Correct.
also, but you could also recognize, I don't think the truth is accessible to us, right? That would be just agnosticism to whatever the particular question is.
Correct.
And then you could say, so I do just want to reserve judgment and hear from everybody.
Correct. The idea is that the less sure you are about what is actually true, the more you're like, well, then I want to hear more opinions from different people. Okay. Now, there are things though that you believe are true. Like you don't want Kolby to have like Steve platform more people preaching outright bigotry, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia,
True.
hateful. You don't want that
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
believe that those things are wrong and you have certain things that you say these are true, and therefore why would we propagate voices that all they do is cause confusion about things that are settled, right?
Yeah, I might take that out of truth in that particular example. For me, it would be more about the harm, like looking at the effects. It's almost like a utilitarian case, which I think doesn't require really analysis of the truth of the propositions. But yes,
But
you're
that
right,
but
ultimately.
but even on a utilitarian basis, your utilitarian philosophy is ultimately based on that you believe that it is true. This is a true statement. It is wrong to harm innocent people. And so based off of that truth that you believe, there's a whole world that you don't tolerate and that you think is beyond the pale because they are not aligned with the truth. Now,
Right. But that
let's
is, hang on, I want to pause you for a second, because
oh,
that
go
is a
ahead.
slightly different truth than what we were talking about. So that's just accepting a truth that's separate from the question that's being analyzed. The question that's being analyzed, we could make a utilitarian case without caring about the truth that's being analyzed. You know what I mean?
Repeat that. Let me make sure I do.
So I just think you had switched which truth we're talking about. If we're talking about the truth of any particular proposition, we can make utilitarian cases without needing to settle the truth of that proposition. Yes, it's true that you're appealing to a true statement to ground your utilitarian approach, but that's a separate truth than what's being considered. Does that make sense? There's two different truths you were talking
Yeah,
about there.
okay, I can see what you're saying. Now, again, I would, as I look at this, do you, um, can you see though that the world is better? Would you say that the world is better the more truth that we have? The more we
Yeah.
understand what is true?
Yeah, so let me share with you. My definition of truth, or the way I understand truth, is the correspondence theory of truth, which is basically truth that's that which comports to reality, right?
Correct.
And
Mine as
so
well.
I believe that all truth is valuable because the more accurate models we have about reality, which they're never completely fully accurate, right? All models can be useful, but not all of them are fully accurate. That the more accurate model we have of reality, the better able we're to make decisions about what the future looks like, about how we want to engage with each other. So yes, I think truth has its own independent value because it helps us understand reality.
Exactly. And I have basically, you could took the words out of my mouth. That's the way I view truth as well. So as I look at things which are true, I believe that the world is better the more that people understand what is true.
Sure.
And you and I both agree that it is wrong, it is true that harming another person is wrong. That is a moral truth that both of us, and we could get into the details, we might have quibbles about that or what we think constitutes harm or whatever. But on a
Sure.
general principle, we agree on that. And that allows us to have a relationship and not yell and scream at each other and actually engage civilly as much as is possible, right? And there's sort of a standard of truth that we both are aligned with. Well, what happens when people have more and more people align with the truth? And what happens when we have more diversity of thought about that? For example, it was not that long ago in human history when, the Roman world, like it wasn't that doing harm to other people was wrong. It was doing harm to people
Sure.
within our tribe is wrong, but do whatever the heck you want to all the other tribes. Now we have moved, now the world is less diverse. We have less people that think that way. So when we see diversity itself, again, it's like diversity is something that if we have a wrong assumption, if we think something is incorrect, or if we actually are incorrect about something, having people dissenting from true and false opinions, true and false ideas, like that's a good thing that people are dissenting from and differing from this false proposition. So the way this relates to the church, and I think even an outsider could see why this would be a problem for the church, is because when you say, well, we need lots of diversity in the church, what you're sort of implying is that the things that we think are true aren't really true. We need to change a bunch of stuff because the truths that we have are not true.
Do you
Now,
feel like someone could hold that position and just say, and this kind of comes back to the way I was asking in the abstract, because we're not sure what is and isn't eternal truth in the church, that's a difficult question to discern, that we are going to reserve judgment and welcome all opinions on a particular question until we are certain.
correct. And that's really what it comes down to. It's sort of like, okay, are we sure we know what gender, that gender is an essential characteristic of our, premortal, mortal, and postmortal identity and purpose? Like, are we sure of that? The members of the church who want more diversity of opinion on that matter are implicitly saying, well, I don't think we can be sure of that.
Are they saying that? Or are they saying they disagree with certain interpretations of what that phrase means? Because I've seen, so I'm going to Sunstone next week. Unfortunately, Steve won't be able to join me, but I have seen, queer members of the church or queer post members of the church use that exact language from the family proclamation and use it to basically vindicate their view, that they feel like that speaks to their experience about how their gender identity is an eternal core part of who they are. So are they really pushing back on the doctrine? And then I have some questions about the doctrine, or are they just pushing back on like your interpretation of what that entails?
Well, in the church, not everyone's interpretation is considered authoritative and binding on the believers. And so ultimately, have the brethren been clear as to what that means?
Do I believe they have been?
Yeah.
Sure. But then, we're going to have to pick up both ends of that stick. And maybe we can just go to the example you selected is
correct. The question is
said,
could they be wrong? Right? Now, here's the thing. That's fine. We can bring that up. But let's recognize what these people are doing. They are implying that when President Nelson says this, that he may be wrong. So he says, marriage between a man and a woman is fundamental to the Lord's doctrine and crucial to his eternal plan. Marriage between a man and a woman is God's pattern for a fullness of life on earth and in heaven. God's marriage pattern cannot be abused, misunderstood, or misconstrued. He says God's marriage pattern protects the sacred power of procreation. And he says, there's one other thing. He says, regardless of what civil legislation may be enacted, the doctrine of the Lord regarding marriage immorality cannot be changed. Remember, sin, even if legalized by man, is still sin in the eyes of God. We cannot change his doctrine. It is not ours to change. His doctrine is ours to study, understand, and uphold. Now, here's the thing. If someone outside the church wants to say, yeah, I think they're wrong about that, that's one thing. But when you're a member of the church that thinks that this doctrine can change, you are just saying President Nelson is wrong here. And you're saying, well, leaders were wrong about blacks in the priesthood, therefore maybe he's wrong about this today. I get the argument. That's fine. But I just want people to be honest about what they're doing.
Sure.
You don't believe what President Nelson just said there. You don't believe it.
But I would offer, so I agree with you that you don't necessarily agree with it, but there is that agnostic space of saying, maybe I'm not sure that he's right. That's not me saying that he's necessarily wrong. I'm just going to withhold judgment, right?
Correct.
There is that space.
And in my mind, that is a big problem in the church, because here's the thing. The brethren, this is one of those things that is, okay, so first and foremost, let's get into it. Okay, if I'm actually making a video about this, I actually already made it, but it hasn't been released yet. I know that prophets are going to be wrong about some things. Like, that's part of our doctrine, that they're going to be wrong. Like,
when you say some things, do you mean they
doctrine.
will be wrong about
yes,
doctrine?
anything, The Book of Mormon, you guys, literally says in its introduction that the scriptures, that the most correct of all books on earth, could have things in it that are wrong. Okay? Any Latter-day Saint who wants to hold on to their silly Protestant and Catholic infallibility, there's somewhere where we can find an infallible source of doctrine, you're wrong. It doesn't exist. It's not part of our doctrine. Just throw it out.
This feels in so much tension with what you just said. Like, you were pushing back on people saying President Nelson might be wrong if he said that.
Correct. Absolutely.
You're saying they can be wrong about everything.
They can be wrong about anything, but that's the whole thing. The question is, what is your methodology for determining what is more likely to be true and what is not? Okay? Like, what's your methodology? Now,
my personal method. Oh,
well, no. I was obviously
it was a rhetorical
you're
question.
kind of throwing it out there. but my point is that a Latter-day Saint has to have. They have a methodology. Everyone has one, whether they know it or not. And you know what most people's is? It's just, well, do I like it? Does it agree with my preconceptions? Does it fit with my political sort of leanings? And that's what they do. And that is the methodology of. Here's the weird thing. We have to be cafeteria Mormons to some extent. Like, that's an impossible thing to, if you have a theological system with fallibility, you are expected to reject certain things. The only question is what? And what is your methodology for determining what? Well, some people might say, well, whatever the brethren say, it's true. It has to be true. Well, here's the problem. Your kids are going to grow up. They're going to realize there's contradictions. And then they're going to go, I can't, that isn't a reliable standard. So what I have found to be the most reliable standard, I know people laugh about it because I don't think they understand it, is that the collective witness methodology for determining not what is true, but what should be considered more likely from God than not when it comes to revelation to God's prophets, if you believe in such, right, is that which has been attested to through multiple witnesses, through multiple dispensations of time, right? Because here's the problem. If something is true, that means that it was true, like when was the time when the principle, I'm not saying the specific thing, that harming an innocent person was a good thing? Like, I don't think that's ever, unless there's some justification for it or something of harming someone, then generally speaking, that's not what you do. Okay. So true things don't change. That's what a principle is. A principle is something that actually is grounded. Because if you just have one person that's saying one thing in one time, and the next person saying, oh, well, this is the truth now, and it totally contradicts the other person. And then, the next prophet says, oh, well, this is the truth now, and it totally contradicts everyone else. They don't have the truth, you guys. It's all noise, no signal for those who like data and data nerds, right? It's just a pattern that's just all over the place. There's no pattern to it. There's no underlying principles that are guiding this thing. It's just arbitrary. And if that's what your religion is, I have no interest in it. Okay? So what you do is you think about everything a prophet says, take every prophet statement as like a data point. And I don't just mean in the restoration's only been around 130 years, okay? Like, our cultures, this is like one subset of the culture. I want to look at the things that cross all of it. That, people are like, there are 10 different prophets over 130 years that taught this. I'm like, I'm not looking at 130 years. I'm looking at 5,000 years. I'm looking at the collective prophetic witness. And the reason, by the way, I believe that you, Kolby, and Steve and others, we all have grown up in a Christian culture that we understand that Christianity doesn't align with holding people or treating some people less than others simply because they're sub-Saharan African. We just recognize that that's wrong. Okay?
I think we recognize that wrong, but I would push back on the idea that is attributable fully to Christianity. Steve and I have had this conversation many times. I think you can attribute it I think you can attribute it in part to Christianity, but to put it real bluntly, when you have, folks in the antebellum South using the Bible to defend slavery, and you have people pushing back against slavery also using the Bible, I would say that the reality is that it's not attributable fully to Christianity, that I would point more to Enlightenment values, like the idea of John Locke's social contract theory, the evolution of how those ideas, which really, I mean, I guess you can attribute them to Christianity in the sense that they are a response to and largely a rejection of accepting Christianity at face value.
Well, I would say that what they were is they were a rejection of the Enlightenment grew out of the Protestant Reformation and the rejection of sort of top-down religious authority. And then what it did is it basically looked at the Bible and said that we don't have, like, individual human beings don't have to be subject to kings and others because we all are sort of equal in the eyes of God. And the moral sort of soil that the Enlightenment was birthed of, it didn't come out of a flash in a pan, right? It was very particularly connected to certain religious ideas of that time period.
Sure, but that's also just survivorship bias. Like everyone in the time period was Christian in the West. And so to then look and say, well, this is attributable to Christianity, it's like, then so is every bad thing. Like so like we just did. So are the people who held slaves.
Why didn't those things evolve in the Islamic world?
Why didn't pushing back against slavery evolve in the Islamic world?
Yeah, like none of those rights in China or in Polynesia or in ancient America or in Viking culture or in, why is it that every other culture in the world just took for granted that human beings are not equals? That because we're not, by the way, like when you look just at face value without some sort of a supernatural sort of statement about that, there's no statement is more ludicrous than the idea that all people are equal. You have to appeal to something beyond that. And it's very clear what they appealed to. They appealed to the idea that all mankind had some sort of a dignity and worth because they all were ultimately, as Steve likes to say, image bearers.
Sure. But I don't know that that was I just don't know that that required Christianity. I know that's a really popular talking point from certain apologists. Like I've heard it from Tom Holland. I think it's over attributing to Christianity what likely is attributable to the Enlightenment. Now, I acknowledge that, yes, it grew out of Christianity. Your question about other historical cultures, the truth is, I just don't know enough about, I have very weird fascinations. Like, I love early American history. I love Mormon history. I don't know a lot about the history of the entire world. So I probably would have to do more research to know, where slavery originated in those societies and what led to it being eliminated in those societies.
Hey, one of my favorite Star Trek episodes of all time, and we've talked about Colby. Colby's not a big Star Trek guy, and I don't know if you're aware of this, Jacob, but basically there's this episode where the Enterprise comes across this planet, and in this planet the Roman Empire never fell, and so they saw a 1960s version of what the world looked like, and they picked up one of their TV broadcasts, and this is this is created by a secular atheist, Gene Roddenberry, right? And just the opening scene when they're watching this gladiator battle happening, right, where they're doing car advertisements. It's like 1960s, but it's the Roman Empire, right? And then the shock on the faces of the crew of this 24th century crew, were just shocked at the violence that's happening, and how it just so then the story, and spoiler alert, but basically the story is there's these group of people that are being persecuted, and they keep on talking about worshiping the sun, and they kept on thinking, oh, these are sun worshipers, but then at the very end the big reveal was, oh no, they're worshiping the Son of God. And in this case, Christianity hadn't been triumphant yet, but the Roman Empire was still powerful, and it just showed how even with a even secular people at that time, like Gene Roddenberry, recognized how important the Christian culture was, and that if we didn't have that, man, it would be much more brutal, brutish, ugly. And I think there was an appreciation in that episode to tell that story, what this world would look like if the Christianity did not triumph.
And it's funny, I'm studying Paul right now in a bunch of depth, and the core issue Paul is dealing with is the fact that the church, that Jesus revealed this idea that there's no more Jew and Gentile, and that everyone can be a part of the covenant family. And it totally blew up Paul's world. It blew up the entire world. Like, this was such a radical notion that broke out of the tribalism of history. Now, granted, it didn't instantly oh, we're all fine, there's no tribalism, but it planted the seeds that ultimately were right there in Paul, that he's struggling with this idea of the inclusion of sort of other people into the covenant. Now, some people may look at that in sense of diversity. And yes, there is an idea of diversity is a good thing when it has an underlying unity that binds it together. Just like an orchestra. If we all have different instruments, is that a good thing? Well, maybe. Let me tell you, if you have a whole bunch of different instruments and they all start playing a different song, it's not a good thing. It makes the noise even more intolerable. And when you have a bunch of diverse opinions and no one has underlying principles that actually connect them all to one another, that's the world of human history. One of the reasons we've made such advancements is because we actually nowadays are less diverse in our global culture, because generally speaking, people recognize basic human rights as morally obligatory on everyone around the world. That was not historically. We were more diverse. What does really wide diversity look like? It looks like tribalism. And that's sort of the point that I'm making here, is that, and this is just, it's demonstrable in the church right now. And I think you guys even know this. The church is becoming more and more divided. The church is not united. We have a wide diversity of opinion on all sorts of matters. Now, here's the thing. If a person thinks the church is wrong, and I think that, Kolby, I think that you would probably say, well, I think the church's stance on gay marriage is a bad thing. Well, then, of course, you support seeing more diversity in the church around that issue. But if you were to see in the church members having more diverse opinions about, black people, thinking that black people, are less valiant in the pre-existence and you shouldn't have interracial marriage, you would push back on that. You'd say that's a bad thing. We need more unity around the idea that all men are created equal and that God is no respecter of persons. So to me, it's just like, let's just be real, guys. Let's just be straight up. People want diversity when they want change, because they think something is wrong. But the thing is that in the church, the more that we think as members that we have wrong, the more we think maybe we have gender wrong, and maybe we have, other things wrong, and gay marriage wrong, and maybe we have women in the priesthood wrong. And there's this constant refrain of like, the church is wrong about everything. All that does is create more division. All it does is create more confusion. And it doesn't create a stronger church. And so the question is, and ultimately we disagree though on what is true. That's just it. And so the church isn't stronger because it has less unity around what's true. The church is stronger. Any group is stronger. But to be honest, I don't know that you guys want the church to be stronger around the areas that you think the church is wrong. And that's why you aren't members of the church. Or at least you, Kolby. I think I probably have more in line with Steve as a fellow Christian, right? So that is where ultimately, that's where I'm going with this. Ideological diversity does not show that we are, like, Christ wanted us to be one in him. And if we're not one in him, then that's a problem.
Yeah, and I think the one place I guess I'd push back, and then I'll use my example, is if we're not sure of what the truth is, I can see ideological diversity. I mean, because it's not just is ideological diversity good or bad. I mean, you used pretty strong language in calling it a cancer in the church. And so, I've been having a series of conversations with Stephen Murphy on Mormonism with the Murph, and they've been really interesting conversations for me because he's a believer. I'm not a believer. We had 4 conversations about the Book of Mormon, about various questions about the Book of Mormon. And the entire purpose of those conversations was just to offer my perspective, allow Stephen to offer his perspective, give each other respectful pushback. And we've developed a really cool friendship in doing that. I feel like that is recognizing the value of ideological diversity. Now, there are some ideas, like you said, ideas that are exclusionary. That's almost where we can get to the idea from Karl Popper about like the paradox of tolerance or intolerance, right? Of if we tolerate opinions that ultimately lead to people's exclusion, well, it's only a matter of time until that can exclude you basically is where that, the paradox of tolerance leads. So I guess just to use the example, when we're not sure what is true, I would say that ideological diversity is not a cancer. And the specific example that you picked, I guess, like I know you well enough, Jacob, to know you don't do anything on accident. So picking racial, the racial restriction on the priesthood was an odd choice to me because I feel like, I'm not sure if you've read Matt Harris's book, Second Class Saints, but this is just from the summary of the book from the inside of the whatever it's called, the dust jacket. Is that what it's called, Steve? You're our book reader. Okay.
Yes.
So, the way it's summarized on the inside is that the book probes the plot twists and turns, the near misses, and the paths not taken of this incredible story, while the notion that Kimball received a revelation might imply a sudden command from God, which I feel like is very aligned with what you were saying about revelation and knowing what the truth is. I just don't think that's reflective of the actual history on this particular issue, because Harris goes on to show that a variety of factors motivated Kimball and other church leaders to reconsider the ban, including the civil rights movement, which placed LDS racial policies and practices under a glaring spotlight. Perceptions of racism that dogged the church and its leaders, and Kimball's own growing sense that the ban was morally wrong. So I think as we look at that particular example, I would say it's only because of ideological diversity in the church that now, what Jacob feels is true has been revealed. And so I guess, Jacob, just help me understand, why did you select that particular example? Because I know you well enough to know it wasn't
I was very intentional about that example because I think it highlights the issue perfectly. Now, I think the ideological diversity on this subject was right. Because they were wrong, right?
And they meaning the prophets, right?
They meaning the prophets, yes. They were wrong about this issue, okay? So that's why I brought it up. Now, but I want to go back to what has happened since then. So what has happened is now the truth is out, and we've said they were wrong, and the Lord is no respecter of persons, all the stuff, and we agree, right? Like all three of us in this conversation, the evangelical Christian, the agnostic atheist, and the active Latter-day Saints. What was that?
I prefer Rando.
Okay. Rando's good. So all three of us can agree that the truth is that it is not morally wrong, for example, for a black person and a white person to get married. Okay. All three of us can, because we think that that is true. Okay. So there's less ideological diversity now among us. The problem that we had is that we didn't know what was true. Now, we could get more ideological diversity today. In fact, there are certain groups that are on the rise politically in this country that are moving back towards that direction. And you know what? If we had more hard right-wing lunatics that want to, stop Mormons from voting and ban interracial marriage, we would have more ideological diversity in this country. What I did is I intentionally chose this example to show that this is a two-way sword, guys. Ideological diversity is not a good in and of itself. It's only a good if someone is wrong about something, and we need to dissent from the wrong opinion. My whole point in this is what I'm getting at. Members of the church who praise diversity on issues like gender and sexuality are undermining what our prophets are teaching. Now, what they are implicitly doing is they're implicitly saying that they think that the prophet may be wrong. They're not sure. Now, my thing is this. I know why they think that. They think that because they live in 2026. There's nothing in scripture that supports their view around gender. And
is there anything firmly in scripture? Because one of the things, I guess, well, let's actually go through this specific example, and then I can ask you that question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So just to deal with the reality of the problem, and we've kind of talked around this. So in 1947, so 31 years before the priesthood ban is lifted, Heber Meeks, who's a mission president, writes to Dr. Lowry Nelson. He's a sociology professor at Utah State University, and I think he switched institutions he was working at in the course of this, these exchanges. He gets this letter because he had worked in Cuba. And so he gets this letter from this mission president asking about the ability of the church to go into Cuba. They're asking specifically, or if there are enough people of the pure white race, is what Heber Meeks asked Lowry Nelson. He writes back June 26, 1947, the attitude of the church in regard to the Negro makes me very sad. Your letter is the first intimation that I have heard there was a fixed doctrine on this point. I have always known that certain statements have been made by authorities regarding the status of the Negro, but I had never assumed that they constituted an irrevocable doctrine. I hope no final word has been said on this matter. I must say that I have never been able to accept the idea and never shall. I do not believe that God is a racist. I think all of us would agree with what Dr. Lowry Nelson says here,
Yes.
right?
Correct.
So he writes this letter back to, that's in his letter back to Mission President Meeks. He decides to write the same letter, enclose a copy of that letter to President George Albert Smith, who was the prophet at the time. I like this second paragraph. Perhaps I am out of order, so to speak, in expressing myself as I have. I have done so out of a strong conviction on the subject, and with the added impression that there is no irrevocable church doctrine on the subject. I am not aware of statements and impressions which have been passed down, but I have never been brought face to face with the possibility that the doctrine was finally crystallized. I devoutly hope that such crystallization has not taken place. The many good friends of mixed blood, through no fault of theirs incidentally, which I have in the Caribbean and who know me in the Mormon world, would be shocked indeed if I were to tell them my church relegated them to an inferior status. And I know you guys know where this story goes. The first presidency writes him back. These lines, I think, are the most important. You know, the basic element of your ideas and concepts seems to be that all God's children stand in equal position before him in all things. Your knowledge of the gospel will indicate to you that this is contrary to the very fundamentals of God's dealings with Israel, dating from the time of his promise to Abraham regarding Abraham's seed and their position vis-a-vis God himself. Indeed, some of God's children were assigned to superior positions before the world was formed. We are aware that some higher critics do not accept this, but the church does. There's another paragraph. Your position seems to lose sight of the revelations of the Lord touching the preexistence of our spirits, the rebellion in heaven, and the doctrines that our birth into this life and the advantages under which we may be born have a relationship in the life heretofore. From the days of the prophet Joseph even until now, it has been the doctrine of the church, never questioned by any of the church leaders, that the Negroes are not entitled to the full blessings of the gospel. He then goes on to talk about miscegenation and does specifically call it contrary to church doctrine and repugnant to most normal-minded people. So signed there by the first presidency.
Correct.
He then writes back. Lowry Nelson writes back. That letter's about 3 pages. He pushes back on this idea. He talks about how it makes him very sad. He gets a letter back from them November 12th. We feel very sure that you understand well the doctrines of the church. They are either true or not true. Our testimony is that they are true. Under these circumstances, we may not permit ourselves to be too much impressed by the reasonings of men, however well-founded they may seem to be. We should like to say this to you in all kindness and in all sincerity, that you are too fine a man to permit yourself to be led off the principles of the gospel by worldly learning. You have too much of a potentiality for doing good, and we therefore prayerfully hope that you can reorient your thinking and bring it in line with the revealed word of God. So I know there's a lot of stuff there. I'm not trying to confront you with all the difficulty of the
I'm well aware of it.
Yeah, I think what it signals to me in the context of this conversation is there's something I love about listening to you, Jacob, and it's that in the abstract, I often agree with you. It's when we get into the specifics that I have a lot of problems. So what would you say to the pushback with what you're saying about diversity in the church with regard to someone who says, someone who held your exact same position would be writing the same letter that the first presidency wrote to Lowry Nelson 31 years before the priesthood ban is lifted?
I'm well aware of that. Now, what I would say is this, I'd say, again, it goes back to methodology. Why do we think that Lowry was right? On what basis are we saying that Lowry was right in this? Did Lowry have a good argument? Did the brethren have a good argument? How are we adjudicating this, you guys?
Well, Jacob, if I'm using your collective witness model, and it's the 1940s, and I have this letter in hand, and I look at the state of Christianity in America, which largely has similar views about race. It's a segregated society in many cases. We have maybe progressive Christians, but who listens to progressive Christians because they're wrong, had positions about race that were more in line with ours. You also had a history of
Actually, in the 19th century, the progressives were the ones who were in favor of, you know, what was it, Margaret Sanger, and cleaning up the weeds in
oh yeah,
society
yeah, yeah.
by
That's
getting
20th.
rid of black people.
That's
20th
20
century progressives
20th
were
century. No,
were
but I'm
wildly racist.
right. But what I'm trying to say is that the same people. Well, yes, I totally granted, and I think one of the great things that Black Lives Matter did was removed Margaret Sanger from the pantheon of great progressives. I think props to them for that. That's for sure. But what I'm trying to say is that we have this consensus within Christianity. Racism was something that did exist. One of the most Christian societies in the world at that time was South Africa,
Well,
and
why
they
do
had apartheid.
my question is, why do we know that they're wrong?
Well, that's the question. What I'm trying to say, I'm taking your a collective witness model and applying it to the 1940s to
He's
determine
saying,
whether or
yeah.
not that this is a doctrine or not. And I would argue that your collective witness model would make a very strong argument this is indeed settled doctrine and that the priesthood ban is legitimate.
Okay. So, what scriptures back up the notion that sub-Saharan Africans were less valiant in the pre-existence?
So,
The
okay,
pre-existence specifically, or that they were cursed with regard to the priesthood?
So that sub-Saharan Africans were cursed in regard to the priesthood. What scriptures support that?
Well, sub-Saharan Africans is a very specific target. There
And
are
there
a
was a
lot of
very
scriptures.
the ban was on a very specific group. It was on sub-Saharan Africans. That's why I'm being very
Sure.
specific.
But there's a lot of scriptural precedent for the idea that God has favored races. So
Absolutely,
that
that's in the
is
Bible.
right. So that's exactly what the first presidency said, right? That this is what follows with God's chosen people. This is just a follow-on of the decision point. If God has chosen people.
Okay. And so where is it been revealed anywhere in scripture that sub-Saharan Africans specifically have some kind of a unique curse?
Well, in Abraham, in the book of Abraham, very
Where?
plainly. Now, this king of Egypt was a descendant from the loins of Ham. That Egypt was discovered by the daughter of Ham, a woman named Egyptus. Thus, from Ham sprang that race which preserved the curse in the land. It goes on in the following verses to talk about how he's cursed as pertaining to the priesthood.
So the people in Egypt are sub-Saharan Africans? Were the
They're
people
tracing
in
it
Egypt
back through
were
Ham.
the people of Egypt the people that did the church ban the priesthood for anyone born in Egypt?
So is the argument going to be that we're talking about a different racial priesthood ban?
Yeah. So in other words, Jacob, our Egyptians.
No, what I'm saying is that the scriptures don't actually support a curse on sub-Saharan Africans.
So what was the reason that Protestants and Mormons gave for
it was the curse
ban?
of Cain and Ham. It was the Hamitic hypothesis.
And what do we see right
popular
here?
in both those cultures? Because the scriptures do talk, the Bible talks about a curse on Ham and Cain. That is something that is biblical. What this scripture does in particular is it continues to echo that same thing that's taught in the Bible. The problem is that there is an interpretation of scripture that arose during the age of exploration between, the 1200s to the 1800s, that the racial group in Africa were descendants of Ham. We now know that that is not true, that is not a correct interpretation of scripture. And so there are not scriptures that actually support this. What happens is that the scriptural basis for all of this doesn't hold up. My point, so real quick, just so you kind of see where I'm coming from on this.
Well,
there is not a scriptural basis for the ban. There is a scriptural basis, a very clear scriptural basis, unambiguous, around our doctrines of marriage.
So when you say there's no scriptural basis for the ban, that just feels like denying the Son to me when it's right here on the screen. Like it literally is talking about cursed as pertaining to the priesthood. It traces all of this through Ham. Who is doing this? Joseph Smith?
No. I'm saying who is cursed?
The descendants of Ham.
Correct. Who are the descendants of Ham?
I am I'm going to have to read that based on what I think Joseph Smith thought, which
You're right.
is that
And if Joseph Smith thought that, which he may have, he would have been wrong, just like the Protestants were wrong,
Yeah, so
just
I
like the
think
Catholics were wrong.
that's what I've always figured, Jacob, is what you're saying is that that Joseph may have even thought that this applied
Of
to,
course,
and this could
he's
tied
in his
in,
own culture.
right? But
Now, here's what's funny.
so
Here's
hang on.
let
wait,
Let me
let
clarify
Kolby.
something. So when you say there's no scriptural basis for the priesthood ban, you
for the
mean
ban on sub-Saharan Africans from the priesthood.
okay, and you reject these verses as being support for that in the scriptures based on what exactly?
Based on the fact that sub-Saharan Africans are not the descendants of Ham.
Okay.
Okay, but real quick, if you look at the images within the Book of Abraham, the character that is the one character that's black in the illustrations of the Book of Abraham is specifically portrayed as a slave. And the Hamite curse is that they are the slave of slaves. So even within the interpretation on the illustration, the black was explicitly pointed out to be a slave, which seems to indicate that the Hamite, this was indicating some idea of a Hamite curse that you may not agree with, but it appears that the translators and the people involved in the Book of Abraham had a clear understanding that that's what was going on.
And that may have been. I don't hold that to be infallible either. At the end of the day, just because if Joseph and again, I don't know necessarily on Joseph, it's a little bit more up in the air because Joseph did ordain black people to the priesthood.
Sure.
Yep.
But it's very clear that the later church leaders, again, crystallize this doctrine more and more around these particular theories about the descendant of man from certain of Noah's sons, one being Ham, who was a descendant of Cain, and who inherited the curse of Cain. And so that whole ethos, that whole biblical interpretation and scriptural interpretation is just false.
Okay, so
Just
Jacob,
is.
what's a modern Canaanite? Who are the Canaanites today?
Probably people in the Middle East somewhere. I would say
And
probably Palestinians would probably be the closest to it. Although the
and
ancient Israelites were probably closer to Palestinians than to modern
and
Jews.
let's just take it a little further, maybe broaden it out a little bit and say, we're talking about Egyptish, which Egypt gets the name from. Is it possible that Palestinians and Egyptians then might arguably should not receive the priesthood to this day based on
No,
that
because I don't
reading?
see anything in that says that there's some perpetual curse that has to be on all people pertaining to the priesthood. And even if in the scriptures it does say that, this person was cursed pertaining to the priesthood, okay, fine. Maybe that's wrong. I don't know. I look to modern prophets to give us guidance on who should and who should not have the priesthood. Everything changed after the people who
in
had the priesthood
1947,
in the old.
that would make the problem much worse, right? That would make the problem much worse until 1978.
Well, hold on. No one had the priesthood outside of the Levites in the Old Testament.
Sure.
Jesus was the one who brought an actual, and that's all in the scripture itself. Jesus brought the universalization of all of this, which Paul, by the way, was like blown away by, and that's what his letters are all about. It's like, holy cow, Jesus has universalized all this. So again, to go to your question, Steve, like, are we nowadays giving the priesthood to Egyptians? We shouldn't. It's like, well, are we giving it to people who aren't Levites? Like, I don't think that holds up really strong.
The one other verse I do want to talk about too, though, is that, of course, within the Book of Mormon itself, what's so interesting to me, the Book of Mormon, the translator decision or whatever we're talking about is basically Lamanites or Native Americans at the time were often referred to as Redskins. And within the Book of Mormon, it doesn't use the term the curse of red skin. It uses the term curse of dark skin as being this curse. So to me, that's just another level to the story that seems to be that seems to be supporting this Black Priesthood ban is this curse of darkness. And if we look at books published by your church in the 1950s that were that Thomas Monson was the editor of, where they literally have photographs of Aboriginal children and showing like, oh, look they're turning white. They're turning white. And I've seen the pictures. It's kind of gross now reading those books. But like this was something that modern prophets thought even before the priesthood ban that would later become prophets. What I'm saying is that there seems to be this issue with blackness and darkness within the Book of Mormon as being a problem as well.
Yeah, the Book of Mormon also says that, the gospels for bond and white, black and free, all are alike unto God. So there's a little bit of a tension there
Yeah, there's
in
a
the
tension.
book itself. Also, the Lamanites end up being kind of the good guys in a lot of ways in the story.
Sure.
And again, no one in the book of, here's the funny thing. Here, and I kind of laugh at people because I actually argue with some Latter-day Saints who try and justify the priesthood ban.
Yeah.
And they try and use these scriptures. And I'm like, you guys, there are literally no sub-Saharan Africans anywhere in the Bible or the Book of Mormon, with the exception maybe of the Ethiopians. That's about the only thing you get. And the Ethiopians are awesome in the New Testament. They're great. So this whole thing, I just look at and I'm like, this is what, so where is this coming from? The thing is, we can see where it's coming from, you guys. Plain as day. The culture of the U.S. at that time and the theories around race that were in the air at that time. It's clear. Now, here's the big point. You know what else I can see clear as day in the culture of our time? See, the priesthood ban and these ideas came about because culture pulled our prophets into bad interpretations of scripture. I see the culture of our day pulling Latter-day Saints away from correct interpretations of scripture. I see it pulling them away from the collective prophetic witness, just like how in the 1850s it pulled them away from the collective witness, which is not to ban black. There literally aren't even black people in the collective witness.
Yeah,
so
but
for you to make claims like that is just wild.
Well, my one bit of pushback, because I've heard you say multiple times before that there is no scriptural basis for the priesthood ban, and I can understand your response. And I agree with it. Obviously, I don't believe the Book of Abraham is scripture. But if I did, I also wouldn't believe that this is a grounding for the priesthood ban that, like it sounds like you're arguing with some pretty interesting people.
Well, priesthood, just quick thing. I want to be very clear. There is precedent for people not being allowed to have the priesthood in the scriptures. Like, that's obvious. Like, go study the Old Testament. It was very narrow.
I'm talking specifically about the priesthood ban.
Yeah, sub-Saharan African priesthood ban, which is what this was.
Yeah, I think because one of the reasons I do some counter apologetics, and I know you might not believe this, but it is the truth. The reason I do it is because there are times that I remember from my time in the church where I was given apologetics that were demonstrably false. And I could prove that they were false at the time that I was given them. For example, when I was on my mission, it was the first time that I heard about and I served my mission in 09 to 11. It was the first time that I heard the controversies about the Book of Abraham. We had this apologetic pamphlet that had been developed with the help of Fair Mormon or some predecessor to Fair Mormon that our mission gave us. I don't have access to the internet. I don't have access to any other books. It says that 27, I still have it on my shelf. It says that 27 of the 30 translations of the facsimiles in the Book of Abraham done by Joseph Smith agree with modern Egyptological interpretations. That is absolute nonsense. There's like almost none, maybe like 2 half hits if you count really liberally with the hits, right? So one of my big purposes in doing counter apologetics is to prevent the building of brittle faith, which is people ending up feeling like they've been lied to by the church or by apologists. And I guess this will sound like a criticism, but I actually intended as like helpful thought, is there's a lot of nuance to saying there's no scriptural basis for the priesthood ban when these verses exist. And I think if people were to discover that with just hearing you make that in an absolute case, which is the only way I've ever heard it made by you, they may feel very misled if they then turn to these verses in their scriptures and it's like, well, this is talking about Ham and it's talking about a curse regarding the priesthood. That very much feels like, even though you have an interpretation on why it doesn't apply to that, which I actually do agree with, people would very much probably feel misled by that bold apologetic claim that there's no scriptural basis for the priesthood ban.
Yeah, I would say when you actually interpret the scriptures rationally at all, absolutely. I agree. I think if a person, I would say that there is no basis for it because the interpretation of those verses that you gave, they operate under an assumption. They operate under the assumption.
Mean what the words mean? Yeah.
No, they operate under the assumption that the descendants of Ham are sub-Saharan Africans.
Okay, but even if that's not true, there is clearly a basis for a ban according to race in these verses. Even if the fact is wrong, the principle is right there.
Same thing as a race. There were, in the Old Testament times, there were explicitly exclusions to the priesthood based on race.
Sure. Those are very different, though, when we're talking specifically about the church's priesthood ban with regard to racial restrictions, and that this is restoration scripture attributable only to Joseph Smith.
Correct.
Right?
But again, the interpretation of that restoration scripture is still resting on the assumption that the descendants of Ham, here's the thing. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Hamites are not, like, descendants of Ham are not sub-Saharan Africans. Let's just say that, like, I went to Brigham Young and them, and, like, they all agreed, like, yeah, you're right. They would then lose any basis for using those verses to justify a ban on it. Literally depends on that assumption. And my whole point is, once that assumption falls apart, then you no longer have a collective, you don't have any real prophetic witness supporting the idea of a ban on sub-Saharan Africans. So we can look at this and say they thought they had a justification based on certain assumptions about Ham that are false.
Sure. And like I said, this was just intended to be helpful feedback on making that argument in the future. I think there's a lot more nuance to that. And I feel like if people hear you say boldly, loudly, without caveat, which is the only way I've ever heard you say it, there is no scriptural basis for the priesthood ban. The reality of the explanation is because the scriptures are just wrong about a factual assumption that they make, which then I think leads to kind of back us back to the conversation we started with, which is, like, when you feel so sure that the church isn't going to change on gay marriage, and to be honest, I don't really, now that I'm no longer a member, there are certain things that I'm really fascinated to follow in the church. There are other things that I just feel like, hey, it's no longer my association. It's no longer my club. I don't really get a vote. And this is one of them. Like, I'm interested in what the future of the church looks like, of course. And I obviously have strong opinions about the basis for treating LGBTQ people differently, but every group has to go through legitimate questions of boundary maintenance. And I recognize that. And I recognize when you're dealing with religious beliefs that sometimes those boundary maintenance questions are really difficult and really hard to navigate. But I think it leads me back to kind of how we started this question, which is, like, you seem absolutely certain that the church is never going to change on gay marriage. And I know you might want to walk through some of those quotes, and that's completely fine. But think about what you just admitted to save admitting that there's a scriptural basis for the priesthood ban, that Joseph Smith built into the book of Abraham false assumptions from his day while claiming that he's translating records from written by Abraham's own hand upon papyrus, right? Like, if we look closely at this, how seriously can we take any doctrinal statement of this is not going to change? Because George Albert Smith was absolutely sure that this was not, that the racial restrictions on the priesthood were not going to change. They were sure about that for another 30 years. By the time they were lifted, it was 25 years from when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. That's a long time. I really did not conceive of how late the priesthood ban was lifted, given how much national sentiment had changed. And I think Matt Harris's book does a great job of walking through this. So I guess help me understand, if prophets can be this wrong, like this wrong, as according to what you just admitted, Joseph was wrong, and just as wrong as George Albert Smith was, claiming things are doctrine that are not only doctrine, but that the church says today are so fundamental to the Book of Mormon's message. It's like, what is the value of a prophet that can't even get something that basic, that fundamental about people's equality before God correct? And why would we take their assertion that this marriage doctrine is never going to change at face value, given their track record?
I guess I would just ask, well, on what basis do you think that they're wrong on those moral questions at all? At the end of the day, I would say that
I'd actually really like to answer that. Can I answer that?
Yeah.
The reality is, because I think a lot of the scriptures that people are going to point to are implicit statements. Joseph Smith never said anything about homosexuality. Jesus Christ never said anything about homosexuality.
No, I'm not asking about that. I'm asking, why do you think they were wrong? Like, why do you think they were wrong about black people? Like, why do you think that they were wrong? I think they were wrong. Saying,
I can do an entire internal critique, which they were absolutely wrong according to the Book of Mormon's own message.
Okay, and I agree with you. So in other words, what I'm saying is that you're appealing to the collective witness model to say this is why those guys were wrong. They internally disagree with that, and I would say that your very moral compass that you use to make these judgments are based off the fact that you've grown up in a culture that has been saturated with the collective voice of God's prophets through the Bible that has formulated the morality of the Western mind.
How does that answer the question, though? How does that answer
What
the
it does
problem?
is this: is I'm
That's
saying
just a
that
heads I win, tails you lose argument.
no, it's a we
It
have
is,
to
though.
look at at where our moral standards come from generally. I use the collective prophetic witness because I recognize that it is the best available source to give us guidance on right and wrong around moral issues. And so the reason I reject the moral or the racial theories of the past is because I can show, as you just submitted, that it contradicts the overall message of Christianity and the Book of Mormon. Okay.
I don't actually agree with that framing, though, because I
You would
do not think I was appealing to the collective witness. I was appealing to a principle. I can critique it purely from an internal critique. I can critique it from an external critique. There are lots of different ways to critique it. None of them, I believe, require appealing to the collective witness. I actually think appealing to the collective witness makes the problem worse for you in this particular instance. We would have another 30 years from the Lowry Nelson letters of living under the racial priesthood ban.
do the
If
do you think the overall message of the Book of Mormon and the New Testament support race like the like for example that black people and white people can't get married? Do they support that notion? Or do they actually work against it?
the overall message of them,
Of the
well,
Book of Mormon and the
obviously,
New Testament.
I believe the overall message would indicate, yeah, that they were wrong, but I don't think I'm appealing to the collective witness. I think that's a very specific model you've developed. And if we incorporate, hang on, if we incorporate prophetic statements and we're treating them like data points, which is what you started with, like, have you actually ever graphed out the data points when you're doing the collective witness, or is it just vibes based?
No,
Because
it isn't just like the number of statements. Okay, the model is looking at because a particular culture can have influence on people. See, one of the things about it is I want to see in cross-cultural situations that what actually survives, because that sort of filters out what's culture versus what's actually true. Okay. And what I had seen is when I look and when I talk about the reason I go to the scriptures is because the scriptures are essentially a collective witness. That's what they are. They're a collection of God's prophets witnessing what God wants to teach the world. And they don't support what was going on in 1850 and 1860 as the church began to develop these policies. In other words, what happens is I can show where they are deviating from what the collective witness says. Now, here's the thing. You ask me, will the church ever change this? You say, no, no, no. Actually, let me caveat that a little bit.
Sure.
Maybe they will change it. But I would use, just like how they changed it in the 1850s, from where black people could be ordained to where they changed it to now they could not. And that change was driven by the culture of that time to deviate from the collective prophetic witness. If our church were now to sanction gay marriage, I would say they have deviated from the collective witness, just like the church deviated in the 1850s from the collective witness around race.
So what are the data points that you feel like ground this?
That ground what?
They ground that the church cannot change on gay marriage in the church.
On gay marriage. What did Jesus, for example, say race or was the purpose of gender?
I don't think Jesus said anything specific about gender.
So Jesus said they were talking about divorce, and he said they asked, or let me find the scripture real quick. In Matthew 19, let me pull it up real quick. So in Matthew 19, they're talking about divorce, but he uses to talk about divorce. He goes back to gender. Interestingly, he says to the Pharisees, "Haven't you read that at the beginning, God created them male and female?" And then he says this, "For this reason, will a man leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Okay? So let's break some of this down. The reason a man will leave his father and his mother was because he was created that. It's part of his nature to be male and female. And that nature that you have in male and female is designed to be made one with your counterpart. This is a reference to Adam and Eve, by the way. Adam and Eve are a prototype for humanity. Okay? And they're to be united, and the two will become one flesh. By the way, when you have children, literally two of you become one flesh. You have a child.
Do you
Okay?
believe in a literal Adam and Eve?
That's actually a long subject I could get into,
Okay.
but the more point here is that I'm just using, again, a data point here that talks about this idea of male and female. If we go back, though, to the Adam and Eve story, and to give sort of my answer, yes, I do believe that there was an Adam and Eve, but I believe the story about them is not really about to teach about the story of them as much as it is to provide an archetype for humanity coming to Earth, choosing to come here, and what our purpose is as humanity. And especially within the temple drama, that is the whole point.
More an etiological story.
Exactly. So the point here is that male and female exist, and they exist for a particular reason. And gender is something that throughout scripture seems to have a very particular purpose, and that God has things around. Now, the restoration then goes a step further. And it says that the reason that this exists is because you cannot reach the fullness of your potential without your counterpart, without male and female. Male and female, and I would say it like this, and some people get, oh, celestial sex and all this stuff. It's like, no. I look at it like this. Male and female are not only physical realities, they're spiritual realities. They're complementary things. And that when they come together, that something that exists with a male and a female is something that is unique. It's like a yin and a yang. And that you are not complete without that other part. That, I believe, is sort of, again, comes back to that question of gender. And I think that there is, I think the collective witness is very clear on that point. Sexual ethics are very clear on that point. They make sense. All of this can be reconciled into a theology that is understandable. And I'm open to being persuaded otherwise. But I feel like what I'm looking at is people wanting to persuade me otherwise because of the culture and trying to reinterpret scripture in ways that are just wildly out of touch with what the scriptures just very plainly say.
Well, but I don't know that they do plainly say it at least as plain as you're representing it, in the sense that if this is truly like as fundamental a doctrine as you're seeming to believe it is pretty implicit what you're talking about here. Like, it's significant to me, for example, that Jesus never says anything about prohibitions regarding homosexuality. Neither did Joseph Smith. If it were as clear as you're stating it is, wouldn't we expect for just a clear statement that this is the way it is and this is never going to change? Because the point of that story in Matthew 19, like, you are reading very finely into an introduction of a story that's actually about Jesus trying to trap the Pharisees and the Sadducees in a tricky question they were asking him about marriage and the afterlife, correct?
Yeah, and what I'm specifically referencing, again, prohibitions are built on some kind of a deeper principle. I would agree, by the way, with you that, like, other Christians, I have no idea why they think that, like, homosexuality and gay marriage can't be okay. Like, genuinely, it's just like an arbitrary command, because marriage doesn't last throughout this life. There is no sort of eternal family unit that's built around the male and female dynamic and relationship. And so I'm just kind of like, I have no idea why you guys are saying that.
So if I'm hearing that correctly, it's not really the collective prophetic witness, at least not in the Bible, because that would be something you share with other Christians. It's more the implicit parts of your interpretation of the plan of salvation.
No, I would say that
correct?
the Bible still says that there's something important about gender, but I think that the restoration scriptures elucidate what that is when you begin to introduce the doctrine of eternal marriage. And, like, for example, I want to talk about being clear. In Doctrine and Covenants 131, it says talking about the celestial glories, in order to obtain the highest, a man must enter into this order of the priesthood, meaning the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. If he does not, he cannot obtain it. Now, if you don't get married, you can't reach the fullness of your potential. That is what that just very clearly says. There's no way around it. And marriage, if you're going to say, like, if you're going to invent a new definition of marriage, like, yeah, let's just change the meaning of all the words and not care what the original authors actually intended and what was being communicated in 1843, right? So it's very clear that the covenant of marriage is necessary for a person to reach their fullness of their potential. And so all of a sudden this goes, oh, wait, now I can see why the Old Testament and the New Testament emphasize this idea of man and woman becoming one and why that unity matters so much, because it's part of what allows us to reach the fullness of our potential.
I know Steve's probably about to turn into a pumpkin over there on the East Coast. Let me ask you one more question. And honestly, I have super enjoyed this opportunity to just talk with you, Jacob, because it's really interesting to have conversations back and forth like this. What would you say to someone who says the scriptures, when we really understand the scriptures kind of in their context, which is that like you're talking about prophets being influenced in the 1850s by their cultural time. And if we look at that and we apply that principle to every single prophet and every single person who's written in the scriptures, you could probably make the argument, and I bet you see where I'm going with this, that, well, maybe because homosexuality is more of a contemporary issue, more of a contemporary need, that because there are no direct prohibitions, unless we want to talk about, Leviticus, and then we've got a whole bunch of other questions that we'd have to deal with. What would you say to the argument that, like, well, maybe the presumption, this implicit argument that presupposes, heterosexual marriage being the standard is because that was just the cultural waters that those people were swimming in? That seems very in line with, to me, with what we see with the lifting of the racial restrictions on the priesthood, which is that it took time for this ideological diversity to bring us full circle, right? This ideological diversity to cause people to reconsider their preconceptions, to set aside their biases, to go and seek revelation from the Lord and to change things. What would you say to that? That these scriptures that you're pointing to, if bias exists and cultural bias exists in the prophetic statements you don't like, you would have to apply that standard evenly to the ones that you're using in your argument for this case. What would you say to that argument?
I would just say that in the prophetic witness, you have a fairly clear sort of emphasis throughout it for the need for male-female marriage. And there is a good theological reason why that would be. Here's the other thing is I also look at alternatives. It's very easy to deconstruct everything and to cast doubt on everything. But ultimately there has to be, okay, so what's the alternative? Like, why does gender exist? Like, why? From your perspective, it would be just kind of an accident of nature, right? But for someone who's a believer, that's a real question. And so when I go to the scriptures and I look, I find the best available answer. I'm perfectly fine with someone convincing me that there's some other model that actually makes sense of the data. But what I find is that the people that are doing that, they don't make good arguments, and they're clearly motivated by the sort of socio-political circles that they run in and the culture of those socio-political circles. And they don't make good sort of arguments from the collective prophetic witness. And when I look for spiritual truth, I go to the collective prophetic witness and I look for who makes the best case from this corpus of God's prophets on what God actually thinks about this subject. And so that's my methodology. And I guess my thing that I want to leave with everyone, because people like to and this is a funny thing, a lot of people are like, oh, collective witness metal, ha ha ha. And they go, okay, so what's your methodology? Here's the thing. They have one. They just don't know what it is. And usually what it is that their methodology is, if prophets say something I like, I go with it. And if I don't like it, then I don't. And I literally, what I'm trying to do with the collective prophetic witness is I'm trying to eliminate that as much as possible. I'm trying to eliminate just doing whatever I like. I'm trying to genuinely look at what God's prophets have revealed and say, if God has prophets and they've revealed something, I want to know what it is. And so I'm going to look at their corpus of work and what they've put out and I'm going to evaluate that as best I can to figure out what I think most likely is God's mind and will on a given subject.
Okay.
Yeah, I think can I conclude and then we
Oh,
can
certainly,
end?
Kolby. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
I would say my biggest pushback on the idea of the collective witness grounding what is true is that there's so many instances we could go through where the scriptures themselves, again, I'm going to make an internal case here. The scriptures themselves give so many opportunities where everybody had the exact same opinion, and then that opinion changed under revelation. So the examples I'd give you is Peter received the vision of taking the gospel to the Gentiles. Before that, that was unthinkable, right? We have the same thing with Doctrine and Covenants 19, where Joseph reveals to Martin Harris or with Martin Harris that, I never said, God says, according to Joseph, that I never said that your torment would be without end, right? I said it was endless because endless is my name. That's like an unthinkable modification of what had come before, right? No one had ever thought of that idea before. And so I guess my one thing would be, or my one pushback on the collective witness model was that it seems like it's very efficient at keeping opinions fixed. And I think that there are instances that indicate, at least in the scriptural models that I'm familiar with, that if people were tied to the collective witness, they would not have received revelation according, again, to the system.
Yeah, and one thing, and I've heard that critique, and just to give my response to it,
Sure.
I would say that, like, for example, Peter with the things coming to the Gentiles and that being unthinkable, there actually is, and I think in Hebrews, there's sort of the case that's made for that, hey, God's plan all along was that his kingdom was supposed to fill the whole earth, and that this was supposed to go beyond just the Gentiles. So there was some scriptural precedent there. However, I don't reject something just because it doesn't have a huge collective prophetic sort of witness behind it, right? If somebody, if the prophet comes out today and says something and it's totally novel, I'm probably going to be inclined to accept it. It's when it contradicts everything before it. And I actually find the New Testament case compelling. That's why I'm not a Jew, is because I actually find the New Testament case compelling that is made to say that things like the kosher laws and things like that weren't actually sort of meant to be for the whole world and all time. And frankly, I think that they're sort of a part of the corruption of things under Jewish rule, but that's another story. But so I don't look at, so there's a difference between something being novel and something contradicting the truth before it, right? And so I generally look for things that emerge. Again, the question ultimately comes down to this: what are you judging things by? Like, what standard are you appealing to decide if something is from God or not? Now, that's a broad question, right? Now, Kolby, for you, if you don't believe that God is out revealing things to people, you don't look at it the same way. But for those who do believe that God reveals things, you have to have some sort of a methodology. I, as a Christian and a believer in the prophetic tradition, I believe God has revealed his mind and will to the world through prophets who are fallible. And so I look at them collectively and I look for what are the patterns. And I say, if there's a strong pattern around a particular subject that's being taught by these prophets, that's going to be the things that I believe is more likely to have come from God than Brigham Young in one statement, in one talk, going off the rails, talking about who knows what, right? There's a difference between the data and the patterns and the outliers. And I even would say that some things like Joseph Smith's interpretation of the revelation on eternality, that's one of those ones like, that seems kind of like an outlier to me. So I hold that view, but I hold it a little more tentatively. You know what I'm saying? So,
and maybe
anyway.
I can end here by saying and I'm actually going to share the way I used to look at this as a believer. So I know you're really interested in like political science and government stuff too, Jacob. I always viewed when Jesus is asked in the Gospels, which is the greatest commandment? And he says, upon this hangeth all the law and the prophets, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. The way I looked at that verse in particular, or that passage in particular, is that like that was the constitution of my Christianity. That was the constitution of my faith.
Agreed.
And anything that came into conflict with that, I felt like, well, maybe there's going to be greater light and knowledge. Maybe I feel like you just said, I'm going to hold it loosely. And I guess since we don't have someone on this panel kind of expressing the opposing view from you as a Latter-day Saint, I would say, as my former Latter-day Saint version, I can understand your position. I can also understand how people look at what science seems to say about whether people can or cannot control their attraction when it comes to, same-sex attraction.
They
And
can, for the most part.
yeah, science basically indicates that that's a reality, right? And that's something that I learned in my program at BYU. And I think there are people who then look at that and they say, well, these old verses may conflict with the constitution of my faith. And I understand that you don't find those cases compelling, but I think that's probably where, if I'm steel manning those people's viewpoint, that it comes from, that they have some principle that they view as being more fundamental than they view your interpretation of what gender serves as that foundation.
I'll let this cut to Steve. Actually, my last thing I'll cut to you, Steve. I would just say this. On that, I do also see, and I believe it comes from a place of love. I believe it comes from wanting to minister. I've been front row seat to all of this stuff, all of the things. Like none of this is like Jacob lives in a bubble and doesn't deal with these sorts of things. And it is hard. But I would also ask, what does it mean to love? And to love is I'm a big fan of Thomas Aquinas' definition, is to will the good of the other, right? And to will someone's good is to will the highest potential that they have. Now, and I've told people this, I don't look at someone like who doesn't achieve celestial exaltation as though they're like burning in hell. Like I don't have that Protestant ridiculous mindset.
That's good.
My view is that I think people will get what ultimately they desire and what they want. And I do believe that some things are higher than others. I do believe that to have your own children is more ideal than to not be able to do that. Even for an infertile couple, I believe that these things are changed in the resurrection, that all of these things are made right. And so I don't think that there is a conflict there. And that conversation that I would like to have with those people is that God is still loving, even though we live in an unjust world. And he's not arbitrarily punishing anyone. He's basically describing what the nature of eternal reality is, and he's trying to help us to align with the way things really are, with truth. And the truth is that ultimate potential is reached in a family. And by family, I mean a male, female with their child, that is the highest form of existence that there is, even though that doesn't mean that other forms of existence are somehow bad or evil, but there's a difference between the ideal and just sort of the fallen world that we live in.
Well, Jacob and Kolby, thank you so much for coming on the program today. It's almost by the way, folks, the intention was this was going to be an hour and 20-minute long episode. So just want to let everybody know that was the game plan going into this. I want to say, first of all, thank you, gentlemen, for allowing me to facilitate, I think, this really important conversation, because I think it's good to see people that are from the opposite side having a civil conversation, which is something, of course, you have been modeling on your program as well, Kolby. Let's disagree with Kolby Reddish, which I do all the time on the phone for hours on end, just like I do with Jacob Hansen. But the thing is, I really enjoy these conversations. And being a gay man, I also want to say that Jacob has been a very good friend to me. And even though him and I don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, we do see eye to eye on a lot of things at the same time too, on certain things. And so I do appreciate my friendship, not only with Kolby, but also with you, Jacob. A couple things. I will be presenting at Sunstone next weekend, but it will be via Zoom. So I'll be there in spirit. And I did want to give a shout out to Mormon Reddit for giving us some good suggestions for conversations that we had today. It was one of the top viewed Reddit posts on the Mormon Reddit today. And I think what we are seeing here, folks, is the evolution of Mormon doctrine before our eyes. This is early days of this young church where they're still figuring things out. We had McConkeyism was the dominant conservative Orthodox position of Mormon apologetics. I think Hansenism is about ready to come in and push back against it. And we are entering into the age of Hansenism, as McConkey's books are no longer sold at Deseret Books last time I checked. So folks, I just wanted to tell you, I first of all appreciate all of you and your thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to having a civil conversation in the comments. So many other things we can talk about. Man, I just want to say too, Jacob, I'd love to even talk about the subject of gay men, the indispensable role that gay men have played in Christianity, which I think is an argument in favor of the collective witness model in one sense, because I think that's an important story that needs to be told. And I think you might be somebody who's willing to have that conversation. And I also want to continue this dialogue with you guys. Maybe we can come back and do this again. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you,
thank
Steven.
you. I
Thanks,
owe you
Kolby.
being in the hot seat next time, Jacob. You've been in the hot seat twice now, so I owe you.
Okay, let's do that.
I appreciate it, Kolby. I think we may have to do that sometime.
Okay. Oh, that'd be great. And if you guys do it on your own, or you have me in there, do whatever you want. I love that we're able to get these conversations. So it's almost 11 o'clock here on the East Coast, folks. There'll be links in the description to everything that we talked about. I'm really excited about the interviews that are coming up soon. You're really going to enjoy them. I think Jacob Hansen did a really good job as my co-host. We interviewed John G. Turner, and I'm excited about releasing that episode soon as well. And we'll have links to their channels in the description. And of course, for those of you who want to financially support us, we have links in the description as well. But remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.